Yo, what is up guys, Grim here, and welcome to my Kafka guide, where you're going to learn everything you need to know about how to build her, and also how good she actually is. In this video we'll be going over Kafka's power level, her kit and traces, rotation and combat tricks, relic and Lightcones, how strong her Eidolons are, and of course her best team comps. Kafka is a lightning nihility character that focuses on damage over time. She pushes the damage over time archetype to new heights and takes it to top tier, with her at the center of it all. Traditionally, damage over time is a slow, methodical playstyle, waiting for enemies to move to deal damage to them. Kafka turns that on its head. She's able to trigger dots on her own turn and explode them when she uses her skill or ultimate, turning the tables and making damage over time a very fast and high damage playstyle. Kafka's personal damage is exceptional, but she also pairs excellently with existing damage over time characters, boosting them up immensely. Some good examples of this are Sampo and Soval, or the newly released Luca. It's also very likely she is going to be at the heart of most damage over time teams, so when new damage over time characters are released, it makes her a pretty reasonable investment if things turn out right. When breaking enemies for wind, physical, lightning, or fire, you inflict a dot on them, a very powerful one which scales with break effect. Kafka's skill and ultimate can also trigger those as well on her own turn, making her a great synergistic pick for break effect builds as well. Kafka and her teams are definitely top tier, and she can easily smash through the entirety of the game in patch 1.2. Damage over time characters are notoriously hard to get excellent relics for, so definitely be ready for a bit of relic farming. Kafka's teams do exceptional damage, but they are damage over time, so you should expect a bit of ramp up time with getting everything ready. And she shouldn't be compared in Memory of Chaos to characters like Blade or Sele who have immediate damage. If you enjoy dots, Kafka is top of her class, so let me show you how to build her. Kafka is the queen of damage over time, with all of her abilities either applying dots or activating them. The majority of her personal damage also comes from shock, so you can definitely expect to be investing heavily on boosting that. Kafka's ultimate, Twilight Trill, is at the heart of her kit and is the main way she applies shock. It costs 120 energy and is an AoE attack that deals 2 break units of lightning toughness to every enemy. Her ultimate is split into 3 separate effects. The first effect will deal a small amount of lightning damage to every enemy on the field when you cast it, and deal the 2 break units of lightning toughness we mentioned earlier. The second effect that happens right after that lightning damage is you apply a massive shock to every enemy you hit. The third and final effect that happens last is Kafka's ultimate will trigger all the dots on every enemy hit, including the shock we just applied moments ago. The way this ends up working is as follows. Let's imagine an enemy who has a shock on them which deals 5,000 damage to them whenever they move. And Kafka applies a new shock to them with her ultimate that deals 10,000 damage every time they move. So when an enemy moves, they take a combination of 5,000 and 10,000 for a total of 15,000 shock damage. When Kafka uses her ultimate against that target, she'll trigger both of those shocks, dealing that 15,000 damage immediately. Triggering dots in this way does not lower their duration or influence the normal damage over time whatsoever. It's a completely beneficial effect, which is extra damage. Depending on the trace level of your ultimate, the amount of damage the triggered dots will deal will vary. We can see with a level 9 ultimate here, it states, immediately take damage equal to 97% of the dot. So we won't be triggering these shocks at full value until we hit level 10 of the ultimate. Traditionally, Kafka's ultimate can only trigger shocks, but after you unlock the bonus ability Torture, it can trigger all damage over times on the enemy, including bleeds, wind shears, and burns, making it a much more synergistic tool for all damage over time teams. Kafka's skill Caressing Moonlight is a blast attack that deals good damage to its primary target and a little bit to adjacent targets. It deals 2 break units of lightning toughness to the primary and 1 to the adjacent. It costs 1 skill point to use and generates 30 energy. The main target of Caressing Moonlight also has all of their damage over times triggered by Kafka, exactly like the ultimate, but it is in a weaker capacity, meaning you won't get full efficiency out of triggering them. It's worth mentioning Caressing Moonlight deals its damage first and triggers the dots second, so if you broke an enemy with the 2 break units from Caressing Moonlight and shocked them with that break, you would trigger that break immediately in the same ability. Kafka's technique Mercy is Not Forgiveness is an entry technique which applies her shock to everyone when you begin the battle. This is definitely a very powerful effect, and because Kafka's primary shock application is from her ultimate, this is a good way to kickstart the battle and ensure you can start triggering shocks and dots immediately with the skill as soon as you get started. Kafka's talent Gentle But Cruel is a follow-up attack that deals decent lightning damage, 1 break unit of lightning toughness, and generates her 10 energy. The follow-up attack also applies her shock, which is incredibly important for her rotation. The follow-up attack activates whenever an ally basic attacks an enemy, and the target of the follow-up attack will be the enemy you use the basic attack on. However, you can only trigger one of these follow-up attacks per basic attack or skill that Kafka uses, meaning it has a 1-turn cooldown. Kafka's final 2 bonus abilities are nice to have. Plunder grants her additional energy whenever a shocked enemy dies, which is particularly nice in Area of Effect. Thorns increases the chance that you will apply shocks successfully to enemies, lowering the amount of effect hit rating we'll need to get in the gearing section. Level up Kafka's abilities in the following order. Prioritize the ultimate above all else. Try and get it to max rank, as scaling it higher gives you substantially more shock damage, and the entirety of her kit scales off of how much shock damage the ultimate does. Level the skill up next, the talent comes after, and finally, if you have bonus materials, you can level the basic attack. As soon as Kafka's bonus abilities become available, unlock them, and then focus on picking the small nodes up behind them for effect hit rating and attack. Kafka's rotation is incredibly smooth. Her ultimate costs 120 energy. Using a skill will get you 30 energy and grant you a follow-up attack, which grants another 10. So every time you use a skill, it's 40 energy. Using 3 skills will grant you the 120 energy you need for Kafka's ultimate. The other part of Kafka's rotation is ensuring you keep her shocks active on all high priority targets. Kafka's shocks only last 2 turns though, and her ultimate, her main way of applying shocks to all enemies, takes 3 of her own turns. Which means, unless she's substantially faster than the enemy, you're gonna have a bit of downtime on your shocks. You can easily fix this though with Kafka's talent. All you need to do is ensure the first basic attack after Kafka moves is on a target with the least shock duration. This will ensure her shock has the highest uptime possible and fix that pesky uptime. When playing Kafka, prioritize using her entry technique over anyone else's to get your dots active, ready, and dealing damage as soon as possible. When playing Kafka teams, your main objective is to get all of your dots active on all high priority targets as fast as possible. Outside of AoE dot applications like Sampo's ultimate, Kafka's technique, and ultimate, it's pretty difficult to keep dots active on all enemies, so just prioritize elite enemies and keep your dots active on them. When using Kafka's skill, always target the enemy that has the most dots on them to deal the most damage. Sometimes it can be incredibly difficult to see how many dots are on an enemy, like this enemy here. We can see they look like they only have 1 wind shear on them, but because of the icon cap on the screen, we actually have to check the enemy's debuffs to get the full story. And we can actually see here they do have Kafka's shock on them, it just doesn't show up. So make sure to check that if you're wondering who to attack with Kafka's skill. When playing Kafka teams, specifically with Sampo, sometimes it makes more sense not to use your ultimates than to use them. In this scenario here, we have an enemy that is fully dotted up. He's going to be taking his turn before the cycle ends. And now Sampo here is going to get his turn as well. We have both Sampo and Kafka's ultimates available here, but you can pretty much guarantee he's absolutely going to die to the damage over times already on him and Kafka's turn that is coming after. So we can save both of our ultimates here for the following wave, which is going to allow us to apply our dots far faster, accelerating our damage substantially and getting us a way faster clear. When applying damage over times, sequencing is important. Remember that Kafka detonates all dots on enemies, so she should always be last to move in a sequence of ultimates. Here we have Sampo's ultimate available and Kafka's. By using Sampo's ultimate first, we can apply the damage over time taken debuff, as well as all the wind shears, and then now we can detonate them all with Kafka's ultimate. Remember, when playing and building for Kafka, you can get a massive free damage over time by breaking enemies for wind, fire, lightning, or physical. You should try and line up your break bar so that you break for one of these elements, and ensure you're bringing Kafka and accompanying characters that can capitalize on these elements. For this reason, Silver Wolf is also exceptional with her. Before we get stuck into relics, let's talk a little bit about what Kafka's best stats are. My most recommended stats for Kafka are speed, attack percentage, and increased damage percentage. Speed will increase the amount of actions Kafka gets access to, allowing her to trigger her own dots and her teams more frequently with her skill and ultimate. Attack percentage and increased damage percentage will scale not only her damage over time, but also her direct damage, meaning it's a clear increase in all departments. Stats that are useful on Kafka but less desirable are effect hit rating, which you'll want a little bit of, or break effect, which can be exceptionally strong when up against lightning weak enemies. If you're playing a break effect specific build, you may want to move it up the priority list, but break effect is only strong when against an enemy that is of course vulnerable to lightning, otherwise it'll have no effect. Situational damage stats that do provide Kafka a damage boost and can be used in their own special Kafka build are crit rate and crit damage. However, they're not my top recommendation for this guide as they don't buff dot damage. Dots cannot critical strike in Star Rail, so you will be losing quite a lot of benefit from these stats when playing Kafka as a dot damage dealer. When stacking speed on Kafka, if you're not sure how much to get, here are a few breakpoints I recommend. I'm personally going to be either running 134 speed or 161 speed on my Kafka, but if you can't reach that, 121 speed is just fine as well. Consult the chart here for the bonuses it provides. Effect hit rating can guarantee Kafka's shocks never miss. You can use the chart in the background to see how much you need against 30% and 40% resistance enemies. Remember that Kafka has 18% effect hit rating on her traces herself, so most of the time you're only going to need 10% effect hit rating on your substats. For Kafka's main set, I recommend a 4-piece band of Sizzling Thunder. Alternatively, you can mix and match 2-piece sets. You can use a 2-piece band of Sizzling Thunder and a 2-piece Wildweed, or a 2-piece band of Sizzling Thunder and a 2-piece Hackerspace set. Lastly, you can also use a 2-piece Wildweed set alongside a 2-piece Hackerspace set. Or finally, a 4-piece Wildweed set. For those looking to min-max or experiment, you can also use a 4-piece Genius of Brilliant Stars. When playing alongside Pella or Silver Wolf, or against a quantum weak enemy, this set can actually outperform everything on this list by a good amount, but it's a little bit specific. You can also use a 4-piece Thief of Shooting Meteor if you're intending to play around with some break effect builds. The Quantum set is definitely strong though. For planar sets, Kafka's options are limited. I recommend a 2-piece Space Sealing Station for almost all Kafka builds. But for those experimenting with break effect, you can also use a 2-piece Talia Kingdom of Banditry. For Kafka's relic main stats, attack percentage is recommended for her body armor. If you're experimenting with critical strike rating though, you can pick up crit rate on the body as well. For the boots, you can grab speed or attack percentage. However, speed is harder to get on substats, so it's recommended to go for speed, especially if you're chasing a higher speed breakpoint. For the sphere, grab a lightning damage percentage. And for the rope, you can go for attack percentage for generic builds or break effect percentage for break Kafka builds. For Kafka's substat priority, you're primarily looking for speed, attack percentage, and a little bit of effect hit rating. Remember, you only need enough speed though to hit your desired speed breakpoint. And you only need enough effect hit rating to ensure that Kafka's shocks land. Unless you're using her Eidolon 1 or her signature, in which you might want a little bit extra to smooth out the hit rating of those abilities. After you've got everything you need and can get of those three, you can go ahead and pick up some break effect percentage, crit rate stats, or some survivability stats. Next up is Kafka's best in slot Lightcones and how they stack up against each other. Kafka's signature is her safest and most consistent Lightcone option, especially when considering team-based combat. It gives a good amount of increased damage, speed, and also applies a special additional shock effect whenever she uses any of her attacks. The cool thing about this shock is it applies immediately when you deal the first instance of damage, meaning when using her skill and ultimate, it'll be applied every single time before the trigger effect happens, maximizing the uptime and damage from this light cone. The interesting thing about Kafka's light cone options though is that she has incredible free-to-play and 4-star gacha options. The light cone Fermata offers her a ton of break effect and also increased damage. Another excellent 4-star light cone is Goodnight Sleep Well, which performs very well at Superimposition 1, granting 36% increased damage, but phenomenally well at Superimposition 5, providing 72% increased damage as long as you can maintain 3 debuffs on the enemy. These 3 light cones are definitely her front runners. A completely free to play option with Fermata, one that you can level up the Superimposition levels to be competitive with her signature with Goodnight Sleep Well, and of course her signature itself. In order to give you guys a little bit more context though, we can refer to some calculations I completed to determine how much damage Kafka deals in an 8-cycle fight solo with each of these light cones. If you're interested in seeing the details of these calculations, they'll be linked down below in the description and the pinned comment. Taking a look at these charts, we can get a rough idea of how each of the light cones stack up against each other for Kafka solo at E0. We can see that patience is all you need is at 100% here because it's the baseline, and everything else is going to be compared to it. We can see that Goodnight Sleep Well here with 3 stacks of a debuff on all enemies at all times is actually 1% better than the signature. But remember, the signature performs a big role in granting Kafka speed. That speed can be used to increase the amount of times she's triggering her team's dots, meaning that the signature likely still wins out in a standard team composition. We can see that Goodnight Sleep Well at S1 is only 84% as good as the signature, and Fermata at S5 is 83% of good as a signature, and numbers in AoE are consistent with this. Overall, I'd still rank Kafka's signature as her best, but she definitely has a lot of viable options. For those looking to invest more in Kafka, her Eidolons are of course very powerful. And similar to the light cone section, we've got full calculations of how strong each Eidolon likely will be when Kafka's solo in an 8-cycle fight at Eidolon 0 and at S1 using her signature. All percentages I quote here are damage increases compared to the previous Eidolon. Kafka's E1 Da Capo causes her follow-up attack to apply an extra debuff when it hits. This debuff increases enemies' damage taken from dots by 30%. The special thing about this debuff though is it's not the same multiplier as increased damage, like increased lightning damage. It's actually a separate one, the same as Sampo's ultimate and Luca's ultimate, meaning it's a much stronger multiplier and is gonna lead to a ton of damage. Remember that her talent is single target though, and as mentioned in the substat section, you might need a bit of effect hit rating to guarantee this effect lands. Assuming you do have it up 100% of the time in single target though, you can expect roughly 19% more damage. And in AoE, assuming you have it up permanently on 2 targets, you can expect roughly 50.5% more damage. Kafka's E2 increases all your units' dot damage by 25%. This yields 10% increased damage for Kafka on single target, and roughly 11% for her on AoE, but also contributes to the rest of your team's damage as well, so don't forget that. Kafka's E4 grants her 2 energy whenever any enemy takes any shock damage from her. This goes for her normal shock damage, her break shock damage, and her signature shock damage. When an enemy has their turn and any 3 of those effects from her trigger, you'll gain the energy. If all 3 of them are present, you'll gain 6 energy instead. You can also gain energy from triggering shocks with her skill and her ultimate. It also works in area of effect, so if you have 3 enemies, all with 3 shocks on them, you'll be gaining a ton of energy. In single target, it's difficult to shorten your rotation with E4, even when using Kafka's signature. But in AoE, it's much easier, and if there's a lot of targets, you can shorten your 3-action rotation down to a 2-action rotation, and if you do, this can actually yield some pretty good results. In my 3 target calculations here, she gets an 11% more damage increase, going from a 3-action to 2-action rotation throughout the majority of her ultimates. Kafka's ultimate adds a colossal amount of base damage to her shock. It also extends the duration from 2 turns to 3 turns, essentially making the shock permanent as long as you've got a reasonably fast Kafka. This massive damage increase results in roughly 30% more damage in single target in AoE, making it one of the strongest Eidolons in the game to date. When it comes to teams, Kafka has an immense amount of options, so many so that if you're interested in specific teams, make sure to check out my dedicated Kafka team video. But if you're interested in how strong each unit is with her, let's get into which ones work best with her. Of course, it goes without saying you're going to want to bring a sustaining character. If you're having trouble surviving, bring both an abundance character and a preservation. But if you can get away with it, try and stick to just using one abundance or one preservation character, as it's going to increase your team possibilities and options immensely. For damage synergies, Nihility is the obvious choice, more specifically some fellow damage dealers, which Kafka can trigger their dots of with her skill and ultimate. For me, Sampo was a top tier pick. He can apply his dots in AoE quickly to synergize with Kafka's ultimate. He can also do a great job of single target dot application and keeping things up thanks to his basic attack applying wind shear, and that can save you a ton of skill points and even generate some for the rest of your team. Luca gave great single target damage thanks to his bleed, and was definitely a solid single target option for Kafka, but a little bit less desirable than Sampo in AoE, but good nonetheless. Silverwolf is particularly effective with Kafka as she can implant the lightning weakness, which allows you to get more break and trigger that break with Kafka's skill and ultimate. She also applies res shred and defense shred, which does synergize excellently with dots as they don't have a whole lot of other ways to scale, and these are definitely ways Kafka doesn't have access to herself. When min-maxing Kafka's teams, ensure all damage over time allies move at least 1 speed faster than Kafka. This allows her to trigger all their dots with her skill. You may also want at least 1 team member dedicated to basic attacking faster than Kafka, so they can trigger her talent on the first cycle of each wave. Harmony characters are also exceptional with Kafka, but they require a bit more effort to make work. They also do suffer from diminishing returns, as opposed to the Nihility counterparts, which generally don't. Bronya can provide Kafka a ton of extra turns with her skill, but it's gonna cost a lot of skill points. Yukong can buff both Kafka as well as an accompanying DOT ally, giving them the double buff, but it's a little bit tough to line up the speed perfectly. Ting Yun is an all-round beast for Kafka, but she does suffer from the diminishing returns, but that extra energy she grants can give you some very nice consistent ultimates. Finally, Asta can provide Kafka a massive amount of speed and attack percentage, but you're gonna need a very specific speed stat already to take full advantage of Asta, and likely a few Eidolons to boot. For defensive playstyles, run an abundance and a preservation character alongside any character I just mentioned and Kafka. Some of my favorites were Kafka Luca, Kafka Sampo, and Kafka Silverwolf. When running higher end teams which use 1 sustaining character, you're going to need a very strong healer. Luocha is a good example, but here are some of my favorites that I ended up running. Playing Kafka alongside Silverwolf with either Luca or Sampo proved to be some of her stronger teams, if you have Silverwolf. You can also play a lightning focused team with Kafka, Ting Yun, and Bailu, with Silverwolf there to implant the lightning weakness. You can also go all in on Dot with Kafka, Luca, and Sampo, although survivability can get a little scary, but it's definitely a fun playstyle. Lastly, you can do a bit of a quirky team with Kafka, Sampo, and Bronya, where you use Sampo's basic attack primarily, and focus on boosting Kafka with Bronya's skill every action. In testing, the highest damage and most consistent team for me was the Sampo Silverwolf team. It had a good mix of defensive options with Silverwolf, and good damage application with Sampo and Kafka. Hopefully you guys enjoyed my Kafka guide. Good luck with your pulls, and until next time, cheers.